Hello Internet and welcome to the introduction of this memorial at the Münchener Platz in Dresden, Germany. It shows exemplary the use and abuse of political justice and totalitarian dictatorships, namely the so-called Third Reich under the fascist National Socialist Party of Germany, the NSDAP, and its successor, the Communist German Democratic Republic, as well as the post-war penal justice executed by the occupation power, here the Red Army and the Secret Service of the Soviet Union. Carrier of this memorial and organizer of the excellent permanent exhibition here is the Sächsischer Memorial Foundation, or in German Stiftung Sächsischer Gedenkstätten zur Erinnerung an die Opfer politischer Gewaltherrschaft. They have a total of 16 memorial sites in Saxony, directly or indirectly under its wing, and is a founding member of the Platform of European Memory and Conscience. The memorial at the Münchener Platz is today situated in the Georg-Schumann-Bau, which was built in 1907 as a state courthouse for the state of Saxony, which still had a king back then and was part of the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II. But it was not only the courthouse that was built, but also a prison or detention center with an attached chapel and an execution site. As you can see in these old blueprints from 1944, the complex was surrounded by buildings like a laundry, workshop and a kitchen that serviced and maintained the prison and to an extent the other buildings. But these are not visible anymore in the aerial photograph as they were completely destroyed in the bombings of 1945. So this whole justice complex was planned and built as one cohesive place, where people would be interned and judged. In some cases they did stay after the verdict of the judge and served shorter sentences at the detention center, and if they had received a death penalty they were executed on site. But for the longest time most of them were transferred to a dedicated penal institution. It was used in this capacity by every government between 1907 and 1957. First the Kingdom of Saxony with the German Empire. Then, after the loss of World War I in 1918, the Weimar Republic took over. They in turn were succeeded by the dictatorial National Socialists in 1933, which soon started to undermine its independence. After the end of the Second World War, the severely damaged prison was used by the Communist Russian occupation power until summer 1950. And the new East German judiciary system used the rest of the also damaged complex, first under the Articles of the Allied Control Council and then after the founding of the GDR in 1949, according to its constitution, or rather according to what the GDR party, the SED, did say. They did reside in these buildings until 1957, after which the still partially ruined buildings were given to the Technical University Dresden, and they continue to use them as lecture rooms and bureaus to this day. When it comes to the goals and the purpose of the judiciary system during the different governments, you can see them in the buildings. Sometimes they are quite literally set in stone. So the history of this complex itself shows the development of the relation to the concept of law rather well. What building extensions and modifications they made and how it was used shines a bright light on the underlying ideology of the particular regime. To make it a bit clearer what I mean, let's look at the courthouse, which was designed as a representation of the justice system in the German Empire. It was the most exposed place of the complex where public would regularly enter and visit. So the architect Oskar Kramer designed it as such, a front of the judiciary system in the empire, loaded with symbolism. This stands in contrast to the rest of the complex that is more plain, simple looking, at least compared to the courthouse. So let's look at these four reliefs. They are situated between the windows of the Schwurgerichtssaal, the jury courtroom. It was the biggest courtroom in the complex and it was here where the most important cases were decided, matters of high treason and other capital offenses. So the position of the relief itself bears some importance, and it is easy to see when you want to enter the courthouse, even if today it should get a cleaning. The relief represents the 4 stages of crime. On the first one you see the criminal after his deed, already bowing, maybe under the burden of his conscience. On the second relief he is in prison, as naturally he is caught by the police. The next one he is sentenced then by the wise judge, clearly indicated by the mighty beard of justice he bears. In the last panel he then does atonement for his crime against society. So the message seems apparent: crime does not pay and you will get caught. This theme continues when you look at the main gate. Right above the entrance, with the big sign that said Königliches Landesgerichts, Royal State Court, is an inscription that reads as follow: Nichts ist so fein gesponnen, dass es nicht käm zu Sonne, which roughly translates to nothing is spun so finely that it wouldn't come to the sun or is exposed to daylight. This is most likely from a poem by Karl von Holtei called Der Kadett im Volksgarten, the cadet in the public park, and is spoken by the cadet shortly before he confesses his crimes. So again, the message is clear: you will be caught and justice will be served. Interestingly, in the poem, the sentence against the cadet is seen as fair and rather merciful. So maybe it is no coincidence that to the left of the inscription is a statue called Mercy. So after you get caught, you will be treated fairly and justly, and according to the law, not arbitrary. The last point is made again in another inscription that was once under the jury courtroom, quoting from the Bible, to be precise, Proverbs 14:34. Gerechtigkeit erhöht ein Volk, justice makes a nation great. So it is the right application of the law, sticking to the letter and the spirit of the law, judging fairly and just, that makes a nation great and civilized. Again, you could see this in the biblical King Solomon, role model of these principles. He had a prominent statue right above the bureau of the court president. This symbolism of a merciful, fair and just system of law was at least the intention of the architect and his contemporaries. It showed a judiciary system that knew about its power and responsibilities, that was bound by law and fairness, and as one critic expressed hopefully, is no stranger to benign humanity. At least that was the idea at the time, and your modern interpretation might of course be different, as it comes with a different outset. One should also not forget that the German Empire was still an authoritarian patriarchy, so experiences of practical application might vary, but it was for most part a state of law, as was the successor state, the Weimar Republic. If we look at the next building in the complex, the detention center, we get a clue on what's changed as time went on and the regime changed. At first, again, we start at the time of its construction in 1907. With a glass roof, the building was flooded with light, seen as an effort to better the conditions for prisoners at the time. There was a library and a classroom to allow the inmates to learn and read while being in detention. The visitor room was also more humane than in most prior prisons. As the prisoners should not be able to coordinate their alibis and such, all the cells were single cells. But every single one had an own water closet, quite a modern rarity then, next to a bench, desk and bunk. To complement the living standard, there was a central steam heating. Contemporaries lauded the prison for its modern concept and execution in safety, hygiene and health standards. This changed over time after the National Socialists took over in 1933. They immediately arrested large numbers of political enemies. According to the Reichstagsbrandverordnung from the 28th February of the same year, they could be placed into protective custody without any court order. The question here is, of course, who or what is protected. Most of these arrested people were brought to improvised concentration camps like the KZ Hohenstein, but they were also put into regular detention centers and prisons like the one we have here. In Saxony, the numbers were so high that they had to reopen the older detention center in the Mathildenstraße. It was originally closed down in 1929 due to its dilapidated conditions. It was soon filled above its capacity of 400 with roughly 450 prisoners in August 1933. With the start of the war, these numbers did rise more, especially in the years after 1942. The main detention center here at the Münchener Platz had its 680 small single cells filled with up to roughly 1,300 prisoners, and the reopened center at the Mathildenstraße had 800 prisoners. The cell you see here was drawn in 1943 by the prisoner Adolf Burres in the Mathildenstraße. Later on, 3 additional inmates were often brought in, so 6 people had to share a cell that was originally designed for 1. The detention center was right from the start filled to capacity, and they had to reopen the old one, but even with these supplemental capacities, they were later on hopefully overcrowded. In addition to being overcrowded, the supply situation also became worse over time. The Kostenverordnung, the Dietary Directive of 1933, decreed simple food for the inmates. But with the general lack of food during the later war years, the prisoners had to make do with what little rations they were given. The menu you can see here shows the meals in October 1942. The daily nourishment consisted of about 350 grams of bread, a handful of potatoes and vegetables, 25 grams of fat or 35 grams of marmalade, and every second day there was roughly 100 grams of meat. The 350 grams of bread, for example, was about half what the Dietary Directive had ordered, and the rations became even smaller as the war progressed. To no surprise, a lot of the prisoners had to go hungry and resorted to bribing wardens or other means to get some additional food. This situation worsened with the introduction of forced labor in 1938 in the prisons. It was often compensated with small amounts of money, but consisted mainly of monotone, repetitive work. First, things like folding envelopes or gluing paper bags, Later on it changed to more taxing work, for example assembling warheads or even excavation. These factors, forced labor, hunger, overcrowding and the lack of basic medical supplies, led to conditions that were bad at first but disastrous at the end of the war, and a large number of people died in the prison as a result of it. The trend of worsening condition continued when the Soviet occupation force took over the partially bombed-out prison. They used the detention center here for their military tribunals and arrests made by the secret police, among other things. Since the confession was the most or even only important part in any trial, done by the Soviets at this time, the imprisonment itself was turned into a part of its practice of interrogation that easily could be called torture. As for example, they covered the windows with wooden screens, only leaving a small stripe open, isolating the prisoners from the outside world. The interrogations then were mostly at night, often included physical or psychological violence, and lasted generally very long. But the prisoner was not allowed to sleep during the day. This isolation and sleep deprivation then led to a lack of will, and finally the prisoner signed the confession the Soviets had prepared. These are only aspects of the horrible conditions in these times. It has a certain irony that this prison was at the forefront of humane justice when it was built, and then descended over time into a veritable hellhole. The prisoners were treated differently, much worse compared to the German Empire and Weimar Republic. The type of prisoner also changed. As said, the National Socialists arrested a large amount of political enemies, and this basically never stopped, and only got worse over time. In addition, a lot of Czech people were imprisoned after the annexation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. The Soviets also mainly arrested political enemies under the guise of denazification and of keeping order. But Nazi war crimes only made up 28.5% of the sentences, while 43.3% sentences were because of espionage and propaganda. This change in the type of prisoners might give a clue to why the treatment changed over time, even if the situation is much more complicated, but I will cover this in more details in some other video. But while the targeting of political opposition and other dissident elements combined with mistreatment of prisoners are shared among the totalitarian regimes, there was also a difference between them. This can be seen in the executions. This courtyard was the place where most of the death penalties were carried out here. But we start again at the beginning, the German Empire. From 1907 to 1918, 5 people were executed here, all with a guillotine, which still had a rather archaic look and was situated on a scaffold, and the whole execution was surrounded by rituals. For example, 12 representatives from the condemned hometown had to be present, and a small bell was rung from the moment the convict left the prison until his death. During the Weimar Republic, not a single person was executed here. With the National Socialists, this changed. Very shortly after the takeover, the first person was executed in Saxony again, and a newspaper wrote that ein scharfer Zug durch die Sächsische Justiz gehe. Finally, firm justice has returned to Saxony. Soon Dresden was chosen as one of 11 centralized execution sites, and construction were done to accommodate the anticipated higher numbers. With these rising numbers, the ritual character was more and more driven back by the thought of efficiency, as you can see here with the so-called Hitler guillotine. The grey stone you see here was where the guillotine was situated when it was used. Since this courtyard is next to bureaus in the public space of the courthouse, the machine was assembled only when needed and otherwise stored in the equipment room. As the numbers rose from only 2 in a year to 50 in a month, they started to cram the executions in time slot to speed up the process, and not having to assemble and disassemble the guillotine every other day. They also changed the time from morning to evening, or to make clear why they changed it, instead of executing before the courthouse opened, they did so after it closed for the day. Right next to the equipment room was the room for the protocolant, who did minute details of the actual execution. This is why we have a pretty clear picture how they went. After the execution, the body was taken to the autopsy room, where it was prepared for further use. Most of these bodies were meant to be delivered to the Medical Institute of Leipzig for the training of doctors and such, but in the later years of the war there were so many bodies that the institute didn't need them, and then they were buried in anonymous group graves. Almost none of the bodies were given to relatives to be properly buried, as they often were declared to be honorless in addition to the death penalty. They were deemed so bad that they had no right to a proper burial or remembrance. 1,345 people were executed by the National Socialists here from 1933 to 1945. 549 of them in 1944 alone. 2/3 of them were Czech, but also around 100 Polish were put to death here. The longer the regime and the war lasted, the more did the death penalty lose its character as a capital punishment. It was not an exceptional punishment anymore and became more and more the standard. In 1944 they spoke on average about 1.7 death sentences per day. The ideology of the National Socialists did see mercy as a weakness, and crime was a question of blood too. So the subhumans from the Czech Republic and Poland, as well as the tainted blood of the German elements that were criminals and traitors, had to be killed off to ensure the fitness of the German race. This shows a difference to the totalitarian state of East Germany, the GDR then. While they are also executed at the same place and with the same method as the National Socialists again, the numbers were much lower. 83 people were executed by the East German judiciary system between 1945 and 1956 here in Dresden. Also, contrary to the National Socialists, after the founding of the GDR, a lot of these death penalty went through the highest channel of the political apparatus. So they started to execute political enemies once more, but the death penalty had a sort of exceptional character again. On the other side, as already said, there was a large-scale denazification effort by the Soviet army in form of the Soviet military tribunals, the SMTs, which more often than not included political enemies. But this was less of an institutionalized form as the National Socialist judiciary system and more of a roaring rampage of revenge. This was now a surface-level look at the judiciary system of these regimes, and I hope you found this to be interesting. The plan is now to follow this up with at least 2 videos covering the National Socialist and the Communist post-war situation. By looking at the specific cases and trials, one can see totalitarian justice up close with all the differences and similarities, and maybe understand why such things as independent courts are so important.